You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. Johann Sebastian Bach, Joseph Haydn, and Kevin Lau, the three composers featured in the next Manitoba Chamber Orchestra concert at Westminster United Church. Though Bach and Haydn are unable to join us this morning, I'm thrilled to say that the outstanding Canadian composer Kevin Lau has, alongside oboist Caitlin Broms-Jacobs, to tell us a little bit more about an exciting world premiere on the program. Kevin and Caitlin, welcome to Winnipeg's Classic 107.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure to have you. I do have to say just how excited I am to have you on the show, Kevin. I'm a big fan of your writing, and I think many of us in the Winnipeg music community are, and lucky us, as we're going to be hearing plenty more of it as you're the recently appointed Manitoba Chamber Orchestra composer in residence. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's an incredible privilege to be part of this orchestra.
Well, I know that appointment was made just last year, though you've worked with the MCO previous to that. Tell us a little bit more about how you're feeling continuing to develop this relationship with the orchestra moving forward.
Well, I was originally commissioned to write a piece in 2018 called Writ in Water. And I had no prior relationship with the MCO, but Vicky Young, the administrator, and we had been talking like over email for quite a few years actually about the possibility of working together. And I believe actually it might have been Caitlin who originally kind of like put my name in the hat, so to speak, for MCO, which I have you to thank for because it's turned into one of the most fruitful relationships for me. And so we had this lovely premiere of this piece, and then shortly after they came to me with the idea of doing an oboe concerto. I think possibly because of the beautiful way, Caitlin, that you played an oboe solo in that written water piece. And you guys were broaching the idea of an oboe concerto, which was great. And really not too long after that, I think even before I actually had the piece written, Vicky asked me if I was interested in doing kind of a more long-term relationship with the orchestra, which is always exciting for a composer because, composers have a lot of things that they often want to say in music. And sometimes it's really, really hard to do everything that's in your heart and soul in the context of just one piece. And so to get to explore a whole range of ideas across several pieces is really, really very wonderful. So,
Caitlin, I'm curious, what was it originally that captured your attention when it came to Kevin's writing, and then really introducing the MCO to his writing, or at least encouraging that exploration of more of his music?
Well, Kevin and I actually first met a long time ago, well over 10 years ago, at a concert that a friend of mine and I organized in Toronto. And that was when I first heard Kevin actually performing one of his own works. And I was just amazed by how beautiful and just really outstanding in every way his composition was. And I believe, Kevin, maybe you were even still a student at that point.
Yeah.
And so, I've been following Kevin's career since then, and his music is so exceptional. So I guess I had an opportunity to mention his name at some point to Vicky and Anne, and it all fell into place. So absolutely incredible.
Kevin, you mentioned that 2018 commission, Writ in Water, which is just exceptional. It's beautiful. And I know that the MCO toured it across Canada. We've played it on Winnipeg's Classic 107. I just played it yesterday, in fact. And it really is a stunning piece. And it's a piece of music that takes its name from a Keats inscription. I'm wondering about this oboe concerto titled Prayer in a Green Cathedral. Does this also take its name from a literary source, or is it from something else?
This title comes from a painting, actually, by a Cuban painter, Thomas Sanchez. And it was funny with this one because I came into the title of the piece about 3 or 4 minutes into the actual writing of the piece. And it was because as I was writing the piece, everything kind of forms in flow. So sometimes it's not like everything is preformed and then you go into it on bar one and then the whole piece is just kind of like, I guess if you're Mozart, that's what happens. But I'm not Mozart. And so things are much more kind of like amorphous and organic. And at around the 3 or 4 minute mark, I thought this is a piece that has some kind of like forest imagery for me. And I actually went on Google and I started to look at stories about forest mythology. And somehow during this whole rabbit hole Google search, I found a series of paintings by this painter, one of which was titled Prayer in a Green Cathedral. And it was just this, if you Google it, it's just this marvelous, it looks like an arch made of trees that kind of like recedes infinitely into the distance. And it's an idealized portrait of nature that brings out the kind of sacred element of it. And it was just such a dazzling image, and it seemed to fit in with the spirit of the music that I was trying to convey. And so I kind of thought, you know what, I feel like this piece is that. I feel like this piece has something of that in it. And the moment I titled it, I knew where the piece was going to go. It kind of took off in its own direction. And so that was kind of how I came across that, really.
It's a fascinating story. It's amazing what Google can connect you with, discovering Cuban painters and their work. The other thing that I'm curious about is, as I understand it, you started working on this piece pre-pandemic, and there was also a certain phrase floating in your mind, petals in the sun. Though those petals got a little bit more shaded as things progressed. Can you tell us about the genesis of this work through the pandemic, bringing us to the premiere this week?
Yeah, I mean, I for whatever reason, and I think I'm trying to think back on the chronology here. Caitlin and I had actually met before I had written a single note, and she had told me about some of the things that she was interested in exploring herself as a performer. And I had her performance in mind. Like, she had mentioned hearing me perform, but I had also heard her perform in the same context, and she had performed this absolutely brilliant performance of a piece by Crystal Hatzis, whose name I can't remember. I don't remember the title of the piece, but I had all of these things in mind. And so for whatever reason, it just kind of gave me a little bit of a starting point for this oboe concerto, which was something that was very sunny in disposition and very lyrical. And that was my starting point. And I had a melody, which is no longer in the piece. It was kind of like a draft melody in mind. But that's where the petals in the sun thing came from. That was just kind of like this, initial imaginary fragment. But then as I started writing it, I came across, as I said, this prayer in a green cathedral idea. And I, in ways that are mysterious and I still can't explain, I kind of discovered a new thematic identity that really, really resonated with me. And that's kind of my clue to start, is when something just really hits me in a certain way and says, okay, this is right for the moment. It's hard to decode it any further than that, but and that became the seed of this new piece. Now, I don't remember exactly the timeline of when I came up with that, but I knew that as I was writing the piece, the pandemic had started. Right. And perhaps inevitably it did cast a bit of a shadow over certain sections of the piece, particularly towards the end. But it was also the direction in which the piece was pushing towards, I think. So it was a combination of, it's like, you don't necessarily want an unhappy ending, but it might seem like the right place for that particular music. And so you just have to follow the instincts that will lead you there. And yeah, I think that's kind of a rambling explanation of how that came about.
Well, no, I appreciate you kind of taking us through that genesis and sort of the magic of the moment, right? And following that trail wherever it leads. Caitlin, Kevin mentioned the sort of collaborative aspect of this, working closely with one another, knowing, the sound world that Kevin creates and inhabits, and then you're playing. Of course, you're no stranger to Winnipeg audiences. You're such a versatile and outstanding player and also arranger. How does it feel to have this work written specifically for you and your playing by Kevin?
Well, I mean, of course, it's absolutely incredible. It's a total dream come true. I think that one of the reasons that everything just is so great about it is that my concept of the music I like to play, the sound that I search for on my instrument, fits so perfectly with Kevin's music. I mean, we talked initially about the ideas of it being thematic, melodic, having like an expressiveness that would suit the oboe really well. And I mean, Kevin has done that in the most exceptional way. Like, I actually think, my personal concept for oboe is in a way sort of halfway, like a cross between a violin and a soprano. And all the possibilities and tone colors and expressive abilities, and Kevin's music just is so beautifully written for that quality of the oboe. And it's just such a joy to practice it and to just like work up to. I mean, everything about working on this, it's been challenging, but it's been like just so satisfying to play this music.
If you're just tuning in, I'm chatting with composer Kevin Lau and oboist Caitlin Broms-Jacobs about a brand new world premiere that takes place in the next Manitoba Chamber Orchestra concert, and that is tomorrow. Now, I want to ask, because in the early days of the pandemic, when many organizations shifted online and sort of bolstered their digital presence, the MCO did this brilliantly through this MCO at Home portal. And I know the two of you gave a chat, and Caitlin, I want to ask you about the various characters, I say with, floating bunny ears here, of the oboe. You talked about how the snake can, or the oboe can play the snake charmer or the shepherd or the toy trumpet. Is there a specific character in terms of this concerto, or is it more just that exploration of the soulful side of the clarinet and its sound, or of the oboe and its sound?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that it. I mean, Kevin, you could tell me what you think about this, but it doesn't fit into those cliches, really. It's much more of a sort of contemporary, romantic, expressive. It's not so trite like as those old characters were. Yeah. I mean, it's not. There's nothing like that at all in that sense. But I mean, those qualities are built into the oboe in a certain sense. So yes, it taps into every possibility of the oboe in all the best ways without it being kind of, I'm not sure the right word for it, but it's so much more than any of that, I should say.
Yeah. Binding. Kevin, did you want to add something further to that?
Well, only that I think that I kind of see some of those categories as being almost like oboe archetypes in a way, where it's actually very useful, and they inform me, I think, maybe at a deeper kind of like subconscious level. I will say maybe the one kind of like traditional characteristic that at least was my starting point before it kind of wanted to a little bit. Very, like, I really had this idea of a kind of pastoralism at the beginning of this piece, where it's just like, right off the top we get the melody. There's no build up to it. There's no prelude. It's just like, it's almost like the Sibelius violin concerto, where it's like a little bit of hush strings, and then you're in, right? And then we just hear it all in all of its glory. So just very like, here it is, and then we're gonna now start the journey with that melody in mind.
Well,
right. And indeed, I think of that opening phrase sort of as a call out into the forest, or as, I mean, it's the opening theme, so everything ties into this in this absolutely incredible way, that the more and more I play the music, the more I look at it and study the score, it reveals so much more, which is the sign of a great piece and a great composer for sure. But like there are moments where I really picture myself in the forest and the wind and the trees, and the imagery adds a lot to my coming up with an interpretation.
And then you also talked about sort of the perhaps more somber elements of, I mean, obviously I haven't heard this work. It's a world premiere, but Kevin, you talked about how you're reticent to say, oh, but it might end sadly. But if that's the way the music goes, I think what's really interesting is there's often that sort of mysterious or slightly darker side to the sound of the oboe. And to hear that the music goes in that direction, I'm so excited to hear how you indulge this. I have one last question for you, and I hesitate to ask this because I was once scolded by a composer for saying this exact thing, but call me headstrong. I'm going to go for it again. Music doesn't really need to give us anything. There's no prescription along the lines of listen to this music, feel this way. But for you, Kevin, in this particular piece of music, is there some sort of overarching something, a feeling, an experience that you hope to give the Winnipeg audience with this work?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad question at all. It's just that it's a hard question, and that's why composers shy away from it. But I mean, the first thing I will say is that a lot of the programmatic elements that we were discussing, the from the painting to the pastoral imagery and all of that, those are interesting elements from a process standpoint. But ultimately, as a composer, what I would want is for a person to come in and listen to this piece and close their eyes, not know anything about the inspiration or any of the technical aspects of it, and still have an emotional experience that is not in any way diminished by not knowing those things in advance. So all of the things that we're discussing in some senses are kind of like they're bonus elements, and they're fun to talk about. But really what I'm trying to get at in any piece of music is a sense of a particular emotional journey. And every piece has its own kind of journey. It's a psychological journey in some ways. I think in this piece, there is the feeling of revealing a world that has that we're very much connected to, that we have a yearning for. Is something that's really ideal and really beautiful. That's kind of like my conception of nature. I know that it's a romanticized version of nature. And then just allowing that image to kind of disintegrate a little bit, almost as if it's a dream that's kind of fading away or that's kind of floating away, and then feeling the loss of that. So it's not that it's necessarily an unhappy ending, but just I wanted to capture that feeling of losing something that was really, really precious. So maybe that's hopefully at least one answer to that question.
Well, people are going to have to journey down to Westminster United Church to experience that and to go on that journey. Kevin, Caitlin, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me at Classic 107 today.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's always a pleasure.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.